So, it is bright, yes. Good evening, everybody. If you don't mind taking your seats, and welcome to those that are already have taken their seats virtually. Before we really get going, we have to lay some ground rules. So I'm hoping I can see them on the screen in a minute. All right, so Rhode Island has specific rules for fire safety and any gathering of more than a small number of people. Just know where your fire exits are, as in they are over there and over there and over there and over there. And so just be ready to know that and get out if need be. The next, it's included in the folder as a code of conduct. It's very standard. Avoid inappropriate and discriminatory actions, show respect, be professional, conduct yourself responsibly, and of course, respect personal boundaries. If there's a problem, people will let me know, but we assume that we're all well-behaved individuals in this room and online, so we don't expect any problems. Thank you. A few rules and reminders, because of course this is not a completely normal meeting. So everything is recorded, it's all your right copyright. Speakers' views are particularly on their own, do not reflect the views of the sponsoring agencies, NIEHS, or the Superfund Research Program, or any other sponsors for that matter. And we are encouraged to use the Hoover mobile app to interact with the e-posters and submit questions. And you'll have 3 months to watch everything later on and view posters on Hoover. All right, as I said, this is not quite a normal meeting. It's actually the first meeting I have this year where people actually sit in front of me, so I'm very glad for this. So what we ask you to do is either be vaccinated or have a negative test. Just to be sure, everybody undergoes a quick screen so that we know there's nobody here who is asymptomatic and still has COVID. We ask you to keep wearing a mask unless eating or unless outside. And I think we're lucky because the weather seems to hold, so probably we can have dinner outside on the roof. That's going to be much, much, much nicer than even watching ourselves with the masks. If possible, and people do that typically anyhow, stick to kind of the same seating arrangement just in case somebody shows up positive, which we don't expect. And then, of course, make use of the outdoors for any conversations on the fresh air to minimize any further risk. And then lastly, socialize, enjoy, and make the best out of a meeting in COVID times. All right, so with that, before we really get going, I wanted to have a land acknowledgement. And we have a friend and colleague from the Meshi-Wampanoag tribe, Councilwoman Winnie Graham-Johnson, who will welcome us properly to the territory here. And I would like to come her on stage. That way, please, unless you want to jump.
You expected me to hop up there?
No.
Katapataj, Dr. Rana. Thank you. Wanikisak, Natasawis Winnie Anoisqua Johnson Graham, Nutamas Masipia, Manaka Nikanahachik, Katapatanmu Wachi Wami Natakusak, Katapatanmu Wachi Wami Sipowash, Katapatanmu Wachi Katahana, Katapatanmu Wachi Aki. I just said, good afternoon. My name is Winnie Johnson Graham, also known as Blue Girl. I'm from Mashpee. I just asked the Creator and ancestors to give thanks for our land, our water, our oceans, and our clean water that we drink. So with that, with no further ado, I'm going to read the land acknowledgement. And with that, I'll say, we gather here today on traditional land of the Mashpee Wampanoag, Niantic, and Narragansett tribal nations. We honor the histories, ancestors, and perseverance in our communities today as our country was built on indigenous land. We acknowledge the indigenous people and honor their stewardship of the land, sea, and resources that they hold sacred and that we are shepherd together. I've been honored to work with Dr. Reyna from University of Rhode Island and Laurel Shader, Dr. Laurel Shader, also from Silent Spring and Steep. And they've been testing our waters, working very well with the Wampanoag tribe. They've been working with us, testing the bay, which they're testing our shellfish bays so that we consume that fish, but also we sell it to some of the big restaurants around here, so also you consume it. So we were trying to check it for the PFAS and the well waters that are in Mashpee. We have the plumes from the base that are coming right into my mother's backyard. And unfortunately, in 1994, my father passed away of brain and lung cancer, neoplasma of the brain at the age of 63. But shortly after, my sister, in 1999, was diagnosed with breast cancer, but they said it was, her lumpectomy was benign. So that was August 30th. Shortly after, in November, her whole body was filled with it. And they said she had non-small cell cancer of the breast. And she passed away February 11th, 2000. And then my mom, actually my dog, I know it sounds crazy, but my dog actually died of brain cancer in between my mom and my sister. And like I said, my sister was 20. My mom passed away the very next year in November of sarcoma of the stomach. And that's 1 in 100,000 chance of you even getting that. So our whole road in Mashpee has been fulfilled with cancer. Everybody on the street has passed away, and the houses, it's a private road, and there's about 7 houses, and everybody in every single one of them houses either passed away or was very sick of scleroderma, which is another rare form of, your skin's. But saying that, we had well water, and back then, well water was the best water you could have. But shortly after, with everybody passing away, my sister and I moved. I have my sister over there, Erica. She's the only last one of my family that I have. And actually, we had some issues too. I've had lumpectomies and I had precancer cells, and I just got rid of a tumor in my leg. And I was like about 97 pounds. And if it wasn't for me and my sister advocating for my health, I probably wouldn't be here a few times. I had a few scares of precancer cells, and I actually advocated for myself. And I feel like PFAS is something that we're still learning, and we need to know more about it, because I had a girlfriend right in Mashpee when I was at one of the conferences for STEEP up in Barnstable, and she was like, "Hi, Winnie," and I'm like, "You look familiar, but I don't recognize you for some reason I recognize your face, but I'm not recognizing where I know you from." And she said, "Nikki from the Mashpee Fire Department." She had no hair. She was smaller than what she used to be, and she was advocating with the PFAS. Lo and behold, thank you for the Creator and God. She is actually still here today because she caught it early enough. But I think that it's something that it's important that for us to learn, because it's something that we're not sure of where it's coming from. We know it's from the packaging, from the food and so forth. I'm not an expert on that, but that's why I'm here today, so that I can learn more, so I can advocate for other families so that they don't have to go through the same thing I went through. So that's why I'm here, and I'm on the Mass Breast Cancer Coalition Board. So I try to advocate for anybody who has these issues, because everybody knows their body better than a doctor, and sometimes they just overlook things because you're young and you look healthy, but we never know because it's that cancer is the silent killer. So thank you for allowing me to speak, and you all have a good evening. Dr. Reyna?
Thank you very much, Councilman Winnie Johnson-Graham, and thank you for the Land Acknowledgement and welcome. So with that, I feel now enabled and entitled to actually move on. So first, a good Butash, a big thank you to you, and we're looking forward to continue working with the Mashpee Wampanoags on PFAS and other concerns. All right, so a big welcome. So we now get going officially. Maybe I should first thank the big team that's behind all of this. And the two that actually spent most of this time were Wendy Lacht, who is over there at the registration table, and Alicia, who just ran the training session together with Matt, and they spent a heck of a lot of time behind the scenes to make this happen. As you might imagine, doing a hybrid event is not really the thing you should do. Either you do one or the other. But given the situation, we found this is what we could do. Also, thanks to Amber, Judith, and Philippe, who helped with some of the concept and all of the details. And behind the scenes, you might never see the two. There's Ryan and Alex, who are making sure that all the slides run smoothly behind the scenes. So big thanks. Later on, you'll see Carrie and Yitke, who run the poster session, and of course, of all our URI supporters, NAHS, other sponsors, friends, collaborators, and attendees. So there's a big list of sponsors, so a big thanks to all of them. And some of them are here in person, so please talk to them. We appreciate the support. So this conference wouldn't happen here and now if it wasn't for NAHS supporting the STEEP Superfund Research Program at URI. That is on the sources, transport, exposure, and effects of PFAS. We call it STEEP. If you want to know more, there's a website, www.uri.edu/STEEP. But you can also see in the folders that you have been given there some of the outreach materials from the Research Translation Corps. The connection to the Mashpee Wampanoag is part of our community engagement activities on Cape Cod. And of course, several of the trainees are here so you can interact with them and see what they're doing. In terms of research, there's environmental fate and transport on the plume of PFAS in the groundwater. There's studies on the epidemiology of PFAS in birth cohorts on the Faroe Islands. There's research into the toxicity of PFAS on cell-based and mouse models, and research into the detection tools of PFAS in the field. So I should put this in writing because we spent a lot of time preparing for this, and we were not sure if this is going to work out. And it's just nice to be in a conference with people, even though you all wear masks. And I'm a little tired of blue and black masks, but nonetheless, much better than seeing people on a screen. It wasn't quite what we had planned. Chris Higgins from Colorado School of Mines, who ran the previous FLUOROS in 2015, talked about STEEP taking this up 3-4 years ago. And he kind of kept pointing out that we had the bandwidth and the people in place to make this a success. So eventually we relented, and then we submitted an application to get support from NIEHS. And then everything was going well. We got the funding, and we had planned to hold this here a year ago in Providence in the late summer. And of course, you all know what happened next. This little thing came up that everybody recognizes now. And maybe this is a good time to take a moment to remember that the US lost over 700,000 people to COVID already. Worldwide, we're looking at millions. We have people who have been debilitated by the disease. It's been a lot of misery for all of us, so maybe we take a quick moment to remember those. But then at the same time, of course, all of us here are a testament that we can and shall move on because we can't be hostage to that virus for the rest of our time. So already last year, we had this challenge, what do we do? We had now COVID, we had a meeting planned, of course we postponed, but we realized we were depriving our trainees of an opportunity to network, to interact, to get feedback, to do something. So Alicia and Heidi stepped up, and a lot of the other trainees, to run a conference that we called PFAS in Our World. It was a virtual event. And as we now know, that's a little easier to organize. So we had a successful meeting, but we still had funding from NEHS to run a conference. So the question was, what we're going to do with that and how we're going to distinguish ourselves from what happened before. And for those of you in the field, back in 2005, Scott Maybury, one of the grandfathers of PFAS research, held the first meeting in Toronto. And at that stage, PFAS was more of a niche problem. It just started to gain attraction. There were a lot of analytical questions. There were contamination issues. There were not sufficient number of standards. So a lot of the discussion was whether the numbers that were reported were trustworthy, what to do, how to move forward. And then PFAS became slightly more important. And in 2015, Chris Higgins hosted the next one in Colorado. Somewhat bigger. By now, they have been recognized as a major pollutant of concern. A lot of different talks covering everything from fate and transport, detection, toxicity, towards remediation. But the question was then, do we need another meeting? And what would it cover? And maybe to give you an idea where we were in 2015. So look at this map of detected sites. Initially, there were very, very few in the US. 12, 13, a few more, 14, 15. All right, it looks like there's a few sites. But of course, this is a map from the Environmental Working Group. If we go back to this map now, we really see that we have hundreds of sites in a given state already. And those, of course, only those states that actually started looking. So we do know that even in the US, we have probably thousands of sites that have PFAS detection. Sometimes some of them are extremely heavily contaminated. If you want to know the details, go to that map. It's interactive from the EWG. So we know of a big problem. And in 2015, we didn't actually realize how big the problem was. So I thought I'll do a little. Has really that much changed in just 5 or 6 years? And it's actually mind-boggling as I went through the list. In 2015, what we had at the time was a provisional health advisory from EPA, and that was at 400 parts per trillion for PFOA and 200 parts per trillion for PFOS. Community people and scientists were not very happy with that, but that's all that existed. EPA only came out with a 70 parts per trillion for both together in 2016. Now we're looking at a place like Massachusetts regulating at 6 PFAS together at 20 parts per trillion. So a complete change of the landscape. And most New England states seem to be following suit with a similar range for a similar number of compounds. Of course, New Jersey has their own, California has their own, but so there's a big change in the recognition of the danger posed by being exposed to PFAS over a long period. As I said, in 2015, a few dozen sites were known. I think Andrea Amiko will start later, will probably tell us her story a little more in detail. She just about got going in 2014-15 about realizing the contamination in Pease. So it was at the very early beginning of recognizing the scale of the problem and the misery it might have caused. And now we're looking at thousands of sites worldwide. We're starting to look at remediation approaches. So it's a very different, more mature situation, if that's the word to use. In terms of approaches of dealing with the problem, EPA had their stewardship agreement, and that was basically the extent of EPA's involvement. And I think there was the hope behind the scenes that that might have just solved the problem. Because now, and you'll hear this more in the sessions to come, we're talking about essential use as one way of looking at the use and proliferation of PFAS in articles. We're looking at setting MCLs, as in mass or in other places. The DoD basically has already been committed to only working with fluorine-free foams. So a lot has changed in just those 6 years. I think it's safe to say in 2015, communities were not taken very seriously. A lot of them didn't probably even know yet that the exposure has happened. So if we move forward to 2021, I'm not going to say everything is great, but certainly community studies are underway by ATSDR. The voices are being heard. Communities are part of supporting the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, Medicine study on PFAS. So there is a pathway that at least the people that are most affected have some way of sharing their concerns and being part of moving forward. And again, through this conference, we hear some more community voices. I think in 2015, the PFAS were clearly the chemicals of concern, but beyond that, the BiPAPs and so on were discovered, but it was still a much more narrow analytical focus. And if we're looking now, the discussion of looking at all PFAS as a class, which might be gaining traction. The non-target analysis is much more sophisticated, including the discovery of all the different perfluoroether carboxylic acids, particularly in the New Jersey, Delaware region, but of course beyond. The use of EOF that was instituted by Scott Murray and Leo Yang is much more standard, even though to a point where EPA is thinking about establishing methods. The TOP assay from the Berkeley group is accepted and is basically taken up by consultancies. So there's a lot of movement of how we're moving forward. And again, we'll talk about novel PFAS as part of a session from the Chinese Academy of Sciences. I think the Arctic was also already recognized as a place of concern. The Stockholm Convention had taken up PFOS. But I think it was still, the idea was that there were localized problems of PFAS pollution. And I think now we can truly say it's a global problem, and we have sessions from all over the globe, from Australia, Asia, Europe, North America. And we see similar problems. We also, of course, have seen the movement and the production of many goods move over to China, which has resulted in a tremendous pollution in China itself. So we know it is indeed a global problem. And I think the last part that has just come out, something from the Green Science and Policy Institute, there's actually data hub for all the available knowledge on PFAS. So that, of course, wouldn't have been imaginable in 2015, but I think the idea for this data hub was hatched in 2015. So yeah, so maybe this will be a song in a few years, back in the summer of 21, because you might, earlier this year, we thought, all right, things are looking good, we're going to have a FLUOROS Global meeting. And the reason we thought this was possible is because, you might recall, the vaccines were suddenly there. We thought we were going to finally get rid of this COVID in a matter of a few months, and by the end of summer we'd just be fine. So we thought we can hold an in-person meeting, but we realized a lot of our colleagues are not allowed to travel, and even our Canadian colleagues are not allowed to travel at this point. We, of course, when we started thinking about this summer, Europe was off to travel, so we realized we can't get the people together we expected to be in Providence for one meeting. And of course, we started realizing that climate change is going to hit us really hard, and this summer was a good example of that. So we thought, what can we do to have a meeting, get the global participation, and somehow live or minimize our carbon footprint? So that was the idea of this FLUOROS Global, try to have people in different places of the world work together as part of a conference. And that's how this hybrid was hatched. Of course, now we're not in the, oh, sorry, you don't speak Greek? Of course, we're not in the summer, in the early part of summer anymore. This is when we learned to learn the Greek alphabet, and then Delta came. And so all of our optimism that the COVID would be done with were a little premature. But I still think, and that's the reason we decided to move ahead, that being in Rhode Island, which is one of the highest vaccination rates in the country, being among scientists or activists who know about risks, should be one of the safest places to be. That's why we instituted a quick test. We want to make sure nobody who's asymptomatic comes in here. Most universities in the region have a vaccine mandate, so we think this is probably one of the safest places to interact with folks. That's what we decided in the end to move ahead. So with that, we have precautions. We still have your masks. We think we can do this safely, but also have interactions again, because that's really what everybody has been missing over 18 months. All right, so what are we going to do? Try to facilitate a global discussion. We learn from the leaders, understand the challenges or challenge the understanding, offer new insights, revisit posters, e-posters, and recordings, organize the exchange of ideas, and socialize safely, and that all would make it FLUOROS if you follow this way. Sorry, it's not very funny, but one of my students would say I make dad jokes. So I try my best. All right, so where are we? We have over 300 attendees covering all continents where people normally reside. That excludes Antarctica. Over 100 posters, half of which are here, half of which are just online. We'll have live attendees in 4 different places: Providence, Brisbane, Beijing, and Brussels. We have over 60 speakers and moderators, and we had over 30 for the training session that was earlier today. All right, so now we have hatched a plan how to deal with this fact that we are not only in Providence. And so some of us are here in person, some are here in spirit, and hopefully all of us are in time. And so we have a little show of how we connect the pieces. And I hope that the people behind the scenes will make this happen now. So this was a hint for Ryan and Alex to do something.
Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Jiang Beibin from Chinese Academy of Sciences, Beijing. Welcome to all the friends to attend the FLUOROS Global 2021. The FLUOROS International Conference is the most important and exciting event in our PFC research community, which gathers and highlights the latest scientific advances and also sharing the perspective on environmental behaviors and the harmful health impact of PFC during a relatively long research period. Look at our progress during the latest 5 years. A lot of contributions are also from our researchers in China, our scholars, especially on the chemical identification, fit evaluation, toxicity assessment, and policy management. A collection of the representative research work will be presented in the novel PFC at this conference. Many thanks for our colleagues from China for your presentation, and I hope all of you can have a good time, both on site and online, and I wish the conference a big success. Thank you.
So that was Professor Guibin Jiang, member of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. He's going to chair a session on novel PFASs this early morning. We have a recording back here in Providence tomorrow afternoon. Then we move across the world to Zurich.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to our session on Towards a PFAS-Free Europe, a science policy dialogue. My name is Zhang Wang. I'm from ETH Zurich, based in Switzerland.
And I'm the co-chair of the session together with Janine, and my name is Martin Scheringer, and I also work at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, or ETH, in Zurich, and I also work at Parasitox at the Masaryk University in Brno, in the Czech Republic.
Our session focuses on gathering leading scientists and the regulators to discuss the big picture of PFAS science and policy developments. Thank you so much.
Yeah, also from my side, thank you for all contributions to the session and your interest in this session.
Martin Schering and Zhangyun Wang from the ETH in Zurich, talking about science policy of PFAS. Then we fly across the world to Brisbane, Australia, with Jochen Müller at the University of Queensland.
Hi everybody, from Australia, I'm Jochen Müller, and I'm really glad to welcome you all to FLUOROS 2021 from Brisbane. It's a great pleasure that we are allowed to participate in this conference as one of the co-hosts, the remote co-hosts in another time zone. And we're gonna host on Tuesday afternoon the remediation session. So I hope to see you all there virtually. and wish you all the best for this conference.
So they'll have a session on remediation. Now we fly back across the world, and in Brussels, the capital of Belgium, and chocolates and truffles.
Hello from Belgium. Hello from Brussels. We look very much forward to this FLUOROS conference and to connect with all of you worldwide. My name is Greet Schutters and I'm connected to University of Antwerp and to VITO, the Flemish Institute for Technological Research. I will share the European session on PFAS and their health impact. The session is organized under the umbrella of HBM4EU. HBM4EU is a big European project to which scientists from 30 countries participate, and we learn more about the internal contamination of European citizens with environmental chemicals. PFAS is one of our priority substances, and what we are doing with respect to PFAS, you will learn more about it by our chemical group leader, Maria Uhl. PFAS is in Europe a big problem. Many contaminated sites are being discovered and people are worried. Also, the regulators don't know very well what to do with it. So we look very much forward to this conference, to the presentations, to the discussions, to learn how to deal with all these issues now and also in the future. So, see you later.
She'll share a session on the human biomonitoring of PFAS and human health effects. And then we come back to this coast and go to Toronto with Amila De Silva from Environment and Climate Change Canada.
Hi, I'm Amila De Silva, and I'm a research scientist from Environment and Climate Change Canada, located in Burlington, Ontario. I've been studying PFAS since I was a PhD student in 2002, and I still continue to research PFAS in the Arctic as well as the Great Lakes. In today's session, we'll be hearing about bioaccumulation, wildlife exposure, and ecotoxicology of PFAS. I want to thank all the speakers today for contributing their time, and I look forward to the lively discussion that follows. Thank you to Steve and the organizers of the FLUOROS conference. I hope you enjoy the session.
Okay, our session is not quite today, but almost. And now we finally get back to where we are, almost. We go to the Cape Cod and the Silent Spring Institute with Laurel Shader.
My name is Laurel Shader. I'm a senior scientist at Silent Spring Institute, which is located in Newton, Massachusetts in the US. I've been studying PFAS since 2009 as part of a broader study that Silent Spring Institute conducted on contaminants of emerging concern in drinking water on Cape Cod. In addition to drinking water, my research also focuses on PFAS exposures from diet and consumer products and on health effects associated with PFAS exposure. Through my work, I've had the opportunity to meet with residents from many PFAS-impacted communities. As part of this conference, I will be chairing the final session on Thursday, which focuses on global transport of PFAS and on the effects of PFAS in the Arctic, with speakers Corey Young, John Odland, and Viola Wahai. So I hope that you'll stick around until then. Thank you for attending FLUOROS 2021.
All right, so that will be the last session on Thursday, live from here. And with that, we're back to where we started, as in Providence. And, so we have plenty of posters, and courtesy of the the American Chemical Society, we have poster prizes for 4 of them. So several of you have been asked to help evaluate and judge those posters. And Carrie McDonough and Jitka Besanova, you probably want to give them your drink tickets, really, if you have a chance. And they are somewhere in the back somewhere, because they are going to run the poster competition behind the scenes. Everything that's printed will be available for discussion and viewing, and every day there's an hour or 2 for poster time. Every poster is also an electronic poster, and the judges are going to see the Hoover version of the posters, and then you can discuss, ask questions, chat with the poster presenters. We also have plenty of break times for those, and of course, A reminder, it's all unpublished, so you can't just take anything that is in a poster and use it. All right, and then at the very end, it's actually funny, the technical support asked whether there was something wrong with my PowerPoint. I said, no, this was a joke. So we promised NEHS to work on a white paper, and it's work in progress. For now, it's pretty white. All right, sorry. And with that, I want to thank you for being here, either in Providence or online. And we can actually now move ahead with the proceedings. And so my first thing to do is actually introduce the next speaker. And it's Andrea Amiko from Testing for Pease. I looked her up, of course. I mean, I've met her now, I think, over the last 4 or 5 years several times. We were planning PFAS conferences at Northeastern. We're both community liaisons for the National Academy of Sciences and Engineering study on PFAS. And she said she is a resident of Portsmouth. She has a husband, 3 children. I'm not sure if you have a dog. And you've become very active in advocating for your community. So you've been a role model, a leader. And we thought we actually highlight some of the voices that otherwise don't get heard, because all the human biomonitoring work always deals with data points, but there's individual stories, and you heard some of the stories already from Winnie Graham-Johnson, and Andrea Amiko has been working at a site that is contaminated by PFAS from firefighting problems. So I would like to welcome you on stage and take over. Thank you very much.
Good evening. My name is Andrea Amiko, and I am a co-founder of a PFAS community action group called Testing for Pease. It is an honor to be here tonight, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with a global audience about PFAS contamination from the community perspective. I have 4 main objectives to cover tonight in my talk to you. I want to start by sharing my personal story with you as a PFAS advocate. I also want to highlight some of the most pressing challenges faced by PFAS impacted communities, followed by much needed change communities need to address PFAS contamination. I then want to end by leaving some tips on how you, the scientific community, can help support impacted communities facing PFAS contamination. A quick background on my community. I live in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. It's a coastal city located on the seacoast region of New Hampshire, and it is located about 57 miles north of Boston. In Portsmouth, the Pease Air Force Base was active from 1956 to 1991. It was made up of about 4,300 acres of land, and in the late 1980s, there were about 4,500 employees on the base, and it was pretty robust back in the day, as it was a strategic air command center during the Cold War. In 1990, the military began leaving, and the Air Force Base closed in 1991 under the Base Realignment Closure Program. However, also in 1991, Pease was classified as a Superfund site, which is a heavily contaminated area identified by the US EPA because it poses risk to human health and/or the environment. In 1991, the Pease trade port started development, and the Air Force Base was transformed and repurposed into the active business park that my community knows today. The Pease trade port is home to about 250 different types of businesses and used to draw about 10,000 people a day to work there. This was pre-COVID, of course. There's still an active airport and Air National Guard base at Pease today, and the Pease trade port is a large economic hub for the seacoast region in New Hampshire. My husband worked for one of the businesses on Pease for over 9 years, and my 2 older children attended a daycare center there, located right next to his work, also on the Pease trade port. Testing for Pease is a community action group. Our mission is to be a reliable resource for education and communication while advocating for a long-term health plan on behalf of those impacted by PFAS water contamination at the former Pease Air Force Base. I co-founded this group with 2 other women, pictured here, Elena Davis and Michelle Dalton. We formed Testing for Pease after reading a newspaper article that changed our lives forever. In May of 2014, we learned that drinking water wells at the Pease trade port were contaminated with high levels of PFAS. At that time, all of our children were attending daycare on the trade port. And as I said, my husband was working there, and Elena and Michelle were also working at Pease. So this was and still is a very personal issue to us and our families, especially our young children who were at the trade port and exposed to highly contaminated drinking water with chemicals we had never heard of before. This caused us to quickly organize, to educate ourselves, and push for action and answers to our questions. The cause of PFAS at Pease came from firefighting foam, known as AFFF, which stands for aqueous film-forming foam. AFFF was used on the base dating back to 1970 to put out petroleum-based fires and for fire training exercises back when it was an active base. But it's important to note they didn't actually test for PFAS in the drinking water until 2014. And sadly, Pease is not unique or alone. We were one of the first communities in the nation to discover this serious problem. However, the Air Force and other branches of the US military use this same firefighting foam at all their military sites across the country. And it's not just the military polluting communities with PFAS. About an hour from where I live, in a town called Merrimack, New Hampshire, they are also dealing with PFAS contamination from a different source. An industrial polluter known as Saint-Gobain Performance Plastics has a factory that omits PFAS in the air from their air stacks and has contaminated the municipal water supply, multiple private wells, and more. And the dots on this map represent other communities in America facing this issue as well. And PFAS contamination is not unique to the US. Sadly, it's a global issue as well. Japan, Italy, Germany, Sweden, Australia, and more countries around the globe are facing PFAS contamination. Having a global conference such as this one provides an opportunity to help unite communities and scientists from all across the world to share knowledge and data and provide networking opportunities to advance the science and ultimately help the people most impacted by this contamination. It is so needed, and I want to thank you so much for being here. Going back to my community story at Pease, we've had many accomplishments for our community since learning of our PFAS contamination back in May of 2014. A PFAS blood testing program was offered to the Pease community in 2015 by our state health department to better quantify the amount of PFAS chemicals in our blood. Multiple groups formed at this time to discuss and tackle the issue, and we successfully advocated that the Air Force filter the drinking water at Pease. The PFAS blood testing program we participated in unfortunately did reveal elevated levels of PFAS in our community's blood. These blood test results left our community with a lot of questions about what this PFAS exposure will mean for our health over time. In 2017, and based on the high levels of PFAS found in the Pease community's blood, the Federal Health Agency, ATSDR, recommended a human health study at Pease. Initially, the Air Force refused to pay for the study, but thankfully our US Senator Jeanne Shaheen stepped in and wrote legislation to mandate DoD pay for the study. We also partnered with Silent Spring Institute to develop a plan to study immune function in children in our community called the PFAS REACH Project. Also during this time frame, I testified at the first ever US Senate hearing on PFAS in DC in 2018, and I was also one of 2 community members invited to attend the first EPA National Summit on PFAS in DC and had a one-on-one meeting with Scott Pruitt, the head of the EPA at that time under former President Trump. In 2019, I attended the President's State of the Union address with Senator Shaheen to raise awareness of PFAS issues in New Hampshire and across the nation. Also in 2019, due to strong community advocacy, my state of New Hampshire passed some of the most protective drinking water standards for 4 PFAS chemicals in the nation at that time, although since then we have seen other states take the lead in regulation on PFAS in drinking water. Our group helped organize and present at the first and second national PFAS conferences at Northeastern in Boston in 2017 and 2019. And 2 years ago, I gave a TEDx talk on my journey as a PFAS advocate. And for the current year we are in, some notable accomplishments are we continue to receive federal funding for PFAS health studies for our community, a drinking water plant at Pease that has both granular activated carbon and resin technology was completed this spring, and the effluent data shows non-detect PFAS levels in the Pease drinking water. This was paid for by the US Air Force. This summer, I presented to the National Academy of Sciences Committee on guidance on PFAS blood testing and health outcomes on the community perspective and needs, and I helped to contribute to PFAS medical monitoring guidance and fact sheets through my role as a community partner on the Silent Spring PFAS REACH project. Our advocacy has accomplished a lot, and our biggest priority for the Pease community right now is 2 ongoing Pease health studies that we are actively recruiting for. The first study is a large study being offered by ATSDR. It's recruiting 1,000 adults and 350 children, which will study PFAS levels and a variety of health outcomes. The second study is called PFAS REACH, and that is a smaller study for preschool-aged children whose mom drink water at Pease, and will focus on PFAS levels and immune function. Both studies are actively recruiting participants in our community. And a silver lining to our advocacy for health studies at Pease is that ATSDR is also conducting a multi-site PFAS health study at 7 other locations across the country. Pease will serve as the pilot model for the multi-site study, and it is our hope that a large coordinated national health study will provide family like ours answers to our questions about the effects on PFAS and human health. Some people have asked, how have you accomplished so much? It's important to note our PFAS advocacy work would not have progressed or evolved without the significant support and leadership from our local, state, and federal elected officials. I can't stress enough how much our relationship and collaboration with these officials and their staff have translated into meaningful action for our community and others across the nation. Another really powerful piece of our work as advocates has been realizing that this work is bigger than just the Pease community. We helped to form the National PFAS Contamination Coalition. This is a group of PFAS community leaders from all over the US and Guam advocating for action on PFAS across the nation. Our coalition members have been directly impacted by PFAS at military sites, industrial sites, airports, fire training centers, landfills, and occupational exposure as firefighters and first responders. The coalition formed in June 2017, and we continue to meet regularly to educate each other, strategize, provide support and empowerment, and work together at a national level to promote change. Our main goal as a national group is to work toward PFAS regulation as a class at 1 part per trillion or less, as we feel that is the most protective standard for communities. Our coalition members' work has consisted of testifying at government hearings on PFAS, attending and presenting at national conferences, participating in exposure assessments and health studies, and actively engaging with many levels of government, academics, scientists, non-governmental organizations, and other sectors all working to address PFAS. We work tirelessly to be seen, to be heard, and to make sure our perspective needs are at the forefront in addressing this widespread public health issue. I want to elevate some of the challenges PFAS communities face. Our biggest challenge is that PFAS is unregulated by the EPA and most states, which means we continue to be exposed to PFAS through multiple pathways. And given the large amount of PFAS in the class, communities are exposed to a mixture of PFAS, not just 1 or 2, not just legacy compounds or new compounds, multiple different compounds at many different levels. Community members are often not seen or valued as critical stakeholders in meaningful discussions with decision makers. And communities bear the brunt of the steep financial costs associated with PFAS exposure. In addition to the economic impact, communities suffer significant stress and emotional costs from being contaminated without consent and poisoned without permission. The government has moved slow on taking meaningful action on PFAS, which underscores my first point, that PFAS continues to be unregulated today at the national level despite all we know about their toxicity, biopersistence, and widespread contamination in this country. And lack of funding to address PFAS can slow down meaningful action desperately needed by impacted community members. Communities also face challenges when seeking guidance from their healthcare providers on PFAS blood testing and medical monitoring. Oftentimes, providers have not heard of PFAS and are not aware of their impacts to human health. Communities may hear inconsistent or minimizing messages from various government agencies, and access to PFAS testing for various matrices is not easily accessible, not affordable, and not always easy to interpret. Given so many government agencies are involved in addressing PFAS contamination, it can be difficult to streamline communication to communities. And a harsh reality for communities is that the people responsible for the contamination have significant resources and can influence key decision makers and interfere with meaningful action needed by communities. For far too long, PFAS have been given the benefit of the doubt over public health, and the burden has fallen on the communities exposed to these chemicals to prove the chemicals cause harm. This is a backwards approach and one that has caused a significant amount of damage to communities all across our nation and beyond. There is a huge lesson to be learned here. PFAS communities have many needs. First and foremost, we need PFAS to be strictly regulated to stop the ongoing exposure to communities. Some ways to do this are to classify PFAS as a hazardous substance and to regulate PFAS as a class and not one or a few compounds at a time. If this is done, it will also put mechanisms and funding in place to fund and remediate the current contamination. And we must make polluters pay the financial costs of this widespread contamination. The companies who profited off these chemicals and are responsible for widespread global contamination of forever chemicals absolutely should bear the significant responsibility and the cost associated to address PFAS. We also need to improve access to low-cost or no-cost PFAS testing of blood, water, air, breast milk, and more. And communities need access to biomonitoring, medical monitoring, and health studies to advance the science on human health effects. We need comprehensive outreach and education to healthcare providers in highly exposed areas to provide the knowledge and tools to allow communities to know what their PFAS blood levels are and to empower them to make changes to reduce their exposure and work with their doctors to monitor their health, prevent chronic illness, and devastating health effects. We need expanded analytical methods to look for PFAS so we have a broader picture of what PFAS may be present in samples. And we need regulations to stop allowing new PFAS on the market. We don't have a good handle on the thousands of chemicals already in our environment, so it's irresponsible to allow new PFAS onto the market. And in that same vein, all products containing PFAS should be adequately labeled to inform consumers. We need the development and implementation of PFAS-free firefighting foams and PFAS-free firefighter gear to reduce the already high exposure firefighters experience in their occupation. And we must prioritize taking action now, based on the science we have today. Communities have been exposed for decades, some families for multiple generations. We cannot wait any longer for our government agencies to take real and meaningful action. And lastly, communities must be seen as critical stakeholders and key decision makers in how we address PFAS in our countries. When communities are valued and given a seat at the table to develop collaborative and respectful relationships with stakeholders, so much can be accomplished to help those impacted by PFAS. We have a saying in our coalition, nothing about us without us. So now that you've heard about my community's journey with PFAS contamination and learned the community challenges and needs, I hope you're feeling a combination of inspired, that communities are rising up and pushing for change, outraged that we continue to be exposed with lack of regulation, and motivated to be part of the solution needed to help communities impacted by PFAS. I will end with some key takeaways that you can do to help. Continue aggressive research to advance the science on PFAS. We need more answers in so many areas of PFAS, and many of you are doing an amazing job. Please keep it up. Impacted communities, please include impacted communities in your research. There are so many communities impacted right now, and they can help you too in ways like establishing research questions and can help write letters of support to obtain funding for projects. They can also guide you on how to report back to communities and the best way to educate their community. You help us so much, but we can help you too. Make yourself available to community groups. We need you and your expertise. We need your networks and guidance. You can do this by responding to our emails, making your research papers available to us, providing technical assistance, introducing us to your colleagues, and speaking at public meetings and hearings. And making yourself available to communities is important, but it's also making you and your work available to decision makers to advance policy and regulation. It's also critically important. Our elected officials have really stepped up the last few years to prioritize PFAS legislation and could use your help and work to advance key policy to help impacted communities. PFAS is an onion with many complex layers, and you will need to be mindful of this when presenting your data to impacted communities in a simple, clear, and meaningful way. And be prepared to repeat yourself or have to offer additional explanation as needed. And lastly, keep in mind that having your research and scientific findings translate into education, knowledge, and action is so empowering to impacted communities. And I hope that you will keep that in the forefront of your mind as you attend this conference over the next several days and beyond in your work on PFAS. With that, I'd like to say thank you for listening to me tonight and end with a quote that has inspired our work all along. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Thank you very much. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you the keynote speaker for tonight. Dr. Elsie Sunderland is the Gordon McKay Professor of Environmental Chemistry at Harvard University. She holds faculty appointments in the Harvard John A. Paulson School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences. Dr. Sunderland's research aims to better understand how chemicals released by human activity interact with normal ecosystems and affect living systems. Prior to joining the faculty at Harvard, she spent 5 years working to inform environmental policy decisions with best available science at the headquarters for the US EPA. Much of Dr. Sunderland's recent work has focused on characterizing diverse exposure sources for PFAS, including drinking water and seafood, and developing chemometric indicators for source attribution. She's also worked to understand the global biogeochemical cycle of mercury for more than 20 years. She has trained over 30 graduate students and postdoctoral fellows and has published over 100 peer-reviewed papers. She is a member of the advisory board for several journals, including Environmental Science and Technology and Environmental Science, Processes and Impacts. It is with great honor to welcome Dr. Sunderland here tonight.
Everyone, I'd like to first thank the organizers for inviting me to kick off this wonderful meeting today. I'd like to spend a few minutes at the start of this conference thinking about exposure science and where we are in understanding the diverse sources of PFAS exposure in a way that we can aid in risk mitigation for these compounds. And so in this vein, I'd like to begin by thinking about why are we concerned about PFAS exposures in the first place. So we know that these compounds have had large impacts on many communities, especially through contaminated drinking water next to point sources, They've been associated with diverse health outcomes like immunotoxicity, metabolic function, impaired endocrine function, and we continue to discover more and more contaminated sites the longer we look. So I'm showing you the current map as of January 2021 from the Environmental Working Group, and if we were to look at such a map over time, we see it growing and growing in terms of our understanding of point sources and communities that are affected by such contamination. Unfortunately, it's not just the communities listed near contaminated sites that have to deal with the PFAS problem. We have ubiquitous exposures of PFAS also present in our general population. So CDC data show us that 98 to 99% of Americans have detectable PFAS in their blood. This is true quite widely, as we can measure PFAS now, even in the most remote environments such as the high Arctic. And this reflects their wide and large magnitudes of use in our everyday products. Many consumer products we now know contain PFAS, ranging from food packaging to furniture and carpet and cookware. And also they're used widely in things like firefighting foams and dispersed in the environment. So this is a large problem. A lot of attention has been focused on PFAS exposure this has been growing over the past couple of years. And we continue to discover more and more health effects associated with exposure, which of course then raises our concerns about developing risk mitigation strategies. I've just linked one example here, linking PFAS exposure to the severity of COVID-19 because it's such a timely endpoint given our present day environment. And so the need to develop or to understand exposure sources and develop effective risk mitigation strategies is critical. And I'd like to talk about a few things that I've been thinking about in terms of grand challenges for really developing those effective strategies and things that are missing. So I want to talk about three main points today. The first is analytical chemistry. So what we're measuring and how we measure it is really dictating how we understand exposure at this time. And the bottom line is I believe we're underestimating our total exposures to PFAS because of what we've been studying in the past and what we're measuring. So we need to move forward from those methods and think about integrating our analytical chemistry methods to develop a more comprehensive exposure metric. The second point I'd like to talk about is how our incomplete data on pollution sources and contaminated sites is affecting our risk mitigation strategies and what we can do with the data we have. So not to focus so much on what we don't have, but what can we do to kind of fill those gaps as new data are being collected. In the United States, then PFAS were just added to the toxic release inventory, but we're still waiting for data on the magnitude of releases from most known sources, and there are many unknown sources. And the third point is really thinking about how and why exposures change in response to shifts in chemical production and regulation. And I'm going to have to go through each topic rather succinctly to fit in my time slot. So just to jump right into that analytical chemistry issue, we need to understand not just the targeted PFAS present in different exposure matrices, but have a more comprehensive understanding of PFAS exposures in terms of organofluorine. So I'm going to define a few terms that I'll use again and again throughout this talk. Inorganic fluorine is very abundant in nature, or fluoride, but organofluorine is really rare. So by organofluorine, I mean this CF bond. There's a few plants that produce it as a toxin, but other than that, when we see organofluorine, it's pretty much a human production issue. We currently are having a number of discussions as a community as to how to define PFAS as a chemical family. But what we can say right now is it's a very diverse chemical family, and there are thousands of different structures presently listed within that family. And we can also say that for organofluorine, PFAS are typically a subset of total organofluorine that we measure. And this is important when we think about analytical techniques for measuring exposure. I'm going to use two terms throughout this talk. One is precursors and the other is terminal compounds. So most of our studies, particularly from health endpoint and from an exposure endpoint as it relates to humans, have focused on just a few terminal compounds. Most of them have looked at PFAS plus PFOA. Some epidemiological studies are getting up to, maybe 6 or 14 different compounds. They tend to be perfluoroalkyl acids, so PFCAs, so carboxylates and sulfonates. And these, so things like PFOA or the hexasulfonate, the C6-sulfonate are really the terminal compounds that led to this name that the press loves, characterizing the fluorine-carbon bond as forever chemicals. So these are not really subject, to our knowledge, to much degradation once they're released into the environment. And that persistence is, of course, a big concern. So we're dealing with a cumulative exposure issue from these compounds because they're so resistant to degradation. However, it turns out that when we look at consumer products, or we look at a lot of our exposure matrices or the releases to the environment, the majority of the mass of fluorinated compounds or PFAS released to the environment are these precursor compounds, and that's really lumping many, many different things. So it's an incredible diversity of compounds. It's very difficult to measure, and we're not typically capturing it with our targeted analytical methods. And so this in itself is posing a challenge because some of these precursors are degrading into these terminal compounds that we associate with adverse health effects. And we don't actually know the health effects that may be associated directly with exposure to some of these precursor compounds. So I believe this is one of the biggest gaps in exposure research, and it's right at that interface between exposure science and analytical chemistry. Just some examples from our own research illustrating this point. So illustrating the point that the targeted PFAS are making up a small component of the total organofluorine present in different potential exposure matrices. Here's a study from a few years ago where an undergraduate had a great time wandering around Harvard University, trying to recreate a day in the life of a student and what they would run into in terms of different vectors of exposure through upholstery or clothing or food packaging. And we used a specific technique known as XPS to measure the total fluorine or organofluorine in these samples. And we showed in this paper that, the targeted compounds were indeed a very small fraction of the total. This has been shown in many studies, not just this one. You can now find this very comprehensively documented in the literature. When we shift gears and think about other types of exposure sources, so we see a lot of exposure or contaminated sites that originated from aqueous film forming foam use, then we find again that the targeted PFAS compounds, and again, not just this study, but other studies have shown this prior to this one, that the targeted compounds make up only a small fraction of the organofluorine in those firefighting foams. So 99% of the contemporary firefighting foams and 50% of the older ECF-based or electrochemical fluorination-based foams consist of these precursor compounds. One of the fun things about this study, led by my graduate student, Bridger Rule, was that you can actually recreate all of the organofluorine in these foams using a very standard method known as the top assay that oxidizes all those precursors into terminal compounds. And he developed a statistical inference procedure to take into account lab data on yields of the terminal compounds from the precursors, plus the information that's measured when you perform that assay. to show that we can reconstruct all the organofluorine in those foams. So we would call those identifiable precursors. And these are, I think, examples of the types of tools that are readily available now that could perhaps be used more widely to make sure that we're capturing all the different types of organofluorine relevant for PFAS exposures in different matrices. In this particular study, we wanted to look not just at the aqueous film-forming foam as a material itself, but also what happens when it gets into the environment and what do you see as it travels through the environment. And we've been studying this for a number of years in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, looking at coastal watersheds, so looking from the fire training area downstream into those coastal watersheds, and where we can account for all of the PFAS burden in the foams as either targeted compounds in green or oxidizable precursors, predominantly in this case in these older foam, where these older foams were used because it's a historic site. So it was C6 precursors. When you move downstream, you actually find a diversity of what we call unknown precursors or unknown organofluorine present in the environment. So that downstream at the mouth of the river that flows into the estuary, where we also have a concern for the propensity of PFAS to accumulate in food webs, we see that about 50% of it is now made up of unexplained organofluorine sources. And this is measured, again, using that extractable organofluorine metric. We've been thinking about what is that? Is that a diffuse contribution from septic systems for things like fluorinated pharmaceuticals or agrochemicals? And I highlight this example again to have you realize the complexity of this issue and the need to tease apart these different fractions of the total organofluorine exposures. A final point, since we were traveling from the fire training area down the rivers into the marine ecosystems, and now I want to look at those marine ecosystems, so at the estuarine and the shelf region, at some data we had at the base of the food web, and link it back again to that precursor exposure issue. So these are data where we looked at uptake into phytoplankton. So immediately, so in the Northwest Atlantic, so offshore of that Cape Cod, Massachusetts site. And what you see in food webs is an increasing propensity for accumulation as we get into the longer chain PFAS compounds. And so you see these nice linear relationships with perfluorinated chain length. It's very similar to what we see for the relationships with PFAS sorption or partitioning. And the most interesting part of this study that we found was really the lack of that relationship for the C5 and C6 carboxylate. Again, consistent with this idea of there are many precursor compounds that are entering the marine environment from diffuse sources like historic AFFF contamination. So those precursors may in fact be entering the food web at an amplified level, and that's an important thing for us to be thinking about as we start to try to quantify exposure more comprehensively. Okay, so I hope I've demonstrated that targeted methods that we're using, so the standard methods, need to be expanded. I also think a big challenge in the field of PFAS exposure right now is the fact that we have incomplete data on exposure sources, and that makes it difficult to develop risk mitigation strategies if we can't characterize the predominant exposure sources. And so what can we do in the meantime? So we can't just twiddle our fingers and wait for perfect data to become available before we go out and try to take action to mitigate some of these exposure scenarios, given the severity of the health impacts that are occurring. So one thing I believe we can do very effectively is use information on source attribution that are contained in the measurements that we're collecting. So the composition of PFAS in different environmental matrices and in human serum is providing clues as to the types of sources that are present. And we've looked at this from the perspective of human serum. We've looked at it from the perspective of surface water in these examples. For human serum in particular, we see that the long chain PFAS that have that enhanced propensity for bioaccumulation, their abundance in serum relative to some of these other standard compounds is a good clue as to enhanced seafood consumption as the primary exposure vector. And in surface water, the example from Cape Cod at the same sites I was showing you a moment ago is showing you a clear signature of AFFF impacted waters in terms of PFAS composition compared to background watersheds without that AFFF source. So presumably you can see that distinct chemical signature from the source, even as you move down gradient from that source region. And I think that's an important clue as to what is the predominant source of pollution in a particular region or for human exposure. It's important to use that just as one piece, in my opinion, as an overall picture of what is the predominant source. So when you're using these kinds of techniques for human data, it's important to also take a bit of an epidemiological approach to exposure and try to correlate it if you have survey data with other behaviors. So for example, for the seafood consuming populations, we looked at Faroese children, and you see a strong association between blood levels of the C11 carboxylate and mercury levels in their blood, which is a good proxy for seafood consumption. You can see this linear association between the children and the distinction between the children that do eat whale meat as part of their traditional diet and those children who were abstaining from eating whale meat. Similarly, in the NHANES data, you can see a relationship between, again, that long chain PFAS, in this case, the C10 carboxylate, and reported number of shellfish meals. So it provides additional supporting evidence that this is a good tracer for that particular exposure behavior. You can even use this kind of epidemiological approach, and that in combination with this fingerprinting approach for things like consumer products. So we found that the hexasulfonate around 2005-06 was a good tracer for increased interactions with consumer products exposure. And you can see, if you take that epidemiological approach, that association with prepackaged food as well. You see this also for PFAS, but PFAS is so prevalently abundant in many different sources that it's not particularly useful as a chemical tracer. And you see no change in these other compounds not associated with that type of exposure vector. So again, it's demonstrating the importance of certain exposure avenues for different subpopulations. So in this case, we were looking at a cohort of pregnant women in Vancouver, Canada. But it could be replicated wherever you have human data. So we have a chemometric approach, and it involves more than just measuring the concentrations and looking at the statistical results. It involves a bit of sleuthing work on the end with thinking about toxicokinetics and intercomparison of the human data, or intercomparability of the human data. In terms of toxicokinetics, when you're trying to take that approach, or when you get to environmental data, thinking about, okay, well, I have suggestive evidence from this clustering for differences in source types. What do I actually see when I try to do some geospatial analyses of the sources present? So in this diagram, the orange spots are where we took measurements, and all the black dots are potential sources. And I'm going to use this as a transition to thinking about this idea of potential sources. So it can be useful to think about those potential sources and whether all the lines of evidence for a predominant source signature in the environment line up. But we can also, when we have those potential sources and confirmed sources, use them in a more quantitatively rigorous way. So when we have, even in the absence of perfect source information, when we have a data set with a bunch of measured values. Like in this example I'm giving you for the state of New Hampshire, where they collected a lot of data on PFAS concentrations in private wells, we can use those data in combination with where we suspect sources to occur and information about factors in the environment that affect PFAS transport to try to develop statistical models to predict where you might see areas that are particularly vulnerable. I will say what we found through this work and iterating on this work is that ground truthing of the source abundance data with local stakeholders, with the people responsible for regulating those sources is really essential, because just doing a naive query of source abundance can result in a lot of errors. This type of source information, and that's what I'm showing you in this slide, the type of information we get when we query databases naively, but databases looking for industries known to release PFAS. So in this case, I'm looking for incinerators and landfills. And this is EWG's list of military sites with suspected or confirmed releases of PFAS. We can use these databases to say something in combination with numerical models about where we might see vulnerable areas. But this moving this suspected category into the confirmed category is really essential, because we can get very different answers about where we consider or where we suspect there might be a vulnerable area, depending on obviously the location of the sources. And here's an example for this, for some of the ongoing work that we have looking at deposition of PFAS, or in this case, PFCAs, from atmospheric sources. And so what I'm showing you, just to highlight the importance of better understanding of source abundance, is that the modeled PFCA difference, depending on how you distribute this inventory of releases. So here it's uniformly emitted versus here it's emitted only at incinerator sites. You have a 4x difference in the modeled magnitude of PFCA deposition. And that relates to the other atmospheric factors affecting the decomposition of those atmospheric precursors. So specifically, when you emit precursors at these incinerator sites in a high NOx environment, you manage to unzip some of that fluorinated molecule and degrade it, resulting in lower deposition rates. Again, the highest level point being we need to work with local stakeholders to improve our understanding of source abundance and work with these databases as best we can to fill the gaps that we have presently. So I have just a couple minutes left, and I want to touch on the last point, which is how can we understand how and why exposures are changing in response to shifts in chemical production and regulation. And when I think about exposure, I often think back to this cartoon from a paper we published, a review paper we published a couple years ago. And we think about it as you can shut off this tap from industry of contemporary production into that broad suite of consumer products and see a fast response. Or we can go out and try to address this legacy contamination issue and at contaminated sites. So things like AFFF that spread diffusely in the environment and then are much harder to clean up, and therefore, and because of the persistence of these compounds, last for long periods of time. So thinking about those timescales, I think, is important when we think about the effectiveness of different actions for risk mitigation. And so when we look at drinking water and we try to say, where are we now? We've been looking at that in the context of the data, again, the imperfect data that we have. So what we have is archived data from a large prospective cohort of US women who actually archived tap water samples in 1989-90. And we have data on their water consumption which originated from various public water supplies across the country. And we can compare that to national data from public water supplies from EPA collected in the last Unregulated Contaminants Drinking Water Rule Monitoring Database, so UCMR3. And what we see when we do that comparison is that there's suggestive evidence for an increase, but there are some limitations. Again, going back to these analytical chemistry challenges, there are some limitations in that data set associated with how you treat non-detects. So if we treat the non-detects as having a 0 value, you end up with this instead, where you can still see these outliers as rising relative to 1989-90. But I would characterize it as suggestive evidence, perhaps, for increases in background exposures through drinking water across the country. The other thing that we have only pilot data for, but I think is really important, again, looping back to that first analytical chemistry discussion, is data on the total organofluorine or extractable organofluorine in drinking water, comparing these two time periods. So this is a small pilot sample, but when we compare that 1989 public water supply data to 2016, we do see suggestive evidence for a large increase in organofluorine in all of those waters, which is consistent with production trends. So it's again emphasizing the need to broaden what we're measuring when we're thinking about exposure. We've also got this experiment that's happened through curbing and phasing out POSF production in the early 2000s, so between 2000 and 2002. And this is what happened in terms of modeled discharges to the ocean. So we can ask, well, what do you see then in people and in food webs following the phase out of that chemical production? And it's very interesting to me because what we see actually is not such so for whales, which don't actually metabolize all the different precursor compounds, we do see a decline in their serum concentrations, but it's driven by the decline in the precursor to PFAS rather than the terminal compound itself. So we studied these whales. These are North Atlantic pilot whales, and we corrected for differences in life scale and things like that. So that precursor compound, again, responding quickly, likely has an atmospheric distribution pathway. We similarly see rapid declines in children, which do metabolize those precursors into PFAS. So we see that large decline in PFAS, some decline in PFOA. This is in the Faroe Islands children, so it's mimicking the human data in the United States. And then the precursor, which is a small fraction because it's mainly metabolized, declining to non-detectable levels, whereas some of these longer chain compounds, which are persistent in the environment, actually remaining stable. I think that the thing that we need to think about, because we've heard this evidence of declining concentrations in many human populations, and that's wonderful in response to that phase out in production, but we can't forget that that was replaced by other types of production, and that's indicated in a different cohort in this slide. Mothers in Sweden, where they did actually measure extractable organofluorine, so thinking more about this as a proxy for total exposure, and that's increasing. So we need to broadly think about these exposure categories. So if I could just summarize my points throughout this talk are basically we need better understanding of predominant exposure sources to develop risk mitigation strategies. Gaps and their solutions, I think, include combining our analytical techniques to close the PFAS mass budget. We have a toolbox of techniques and we need standardization of these methods, and it would be nice if they were a little bit easier to use. We need to fill this gap in pollution source information, and we have a variety of techniques that I've talked about. And then we do need to continue to monitor these impacts of changes in production and regulation on exposure, again, comprehensively using this toolbox of methods. So I'd like to end by acknowledging all the wonderful individuals and collaborators that I've had the pleasure of working with, including the very talented trainees, to put together this work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sunderland, for that very helpful and informative presentation. But now we'll take some questions, and we want to welcome her back, and we will take some questions. Yep, go ahead. Yeah, do we have her shout it out, Reiner? Is there a microphone?
I'm intrigued by the idea of trying to make methods easier and thinking in particular total organic fluorine, but I'm just curious what kind of methods you had in mind that you would like to be easier to do.
Thank you for the question. That's a great question. What I was in fact thinking about was this broad suite of methods that we use. And I think it would be nice if we had something that was more readily usable. Unfortunately, I think what we have is a toolbox of techniques, and each fills a different gap. I think the appeal of things like some of these total fluorine metrics is that they are relatively simpler to use compared to, say, high resolution mass spectrometry. But they give us different types of information. So the information we're getting from each of these metrics right now is complementary. So I'm afraid I don't have an answer to your question, but I hope that throughout the conference, the analytical chemists will talk about this issue. I think we've seen a lot of innovation in the field over the past number of years. So I'm hopeful that this is foremost on their minds, and we'll make some progress in this area.
So in Mashpee, we had 5 blue heron that had passed away in the Mashpee River. And they said that would be maybe 5 within 5 years. So I'm just wondering if there's anything that you have for testing, because they keep saying there's nothing in the water, or they can't find any reason why the heron are passing away. So I didn't know if there was anything that you had for testing for the waters, for the fish that are passing away, but more so the blue heron. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think we've recently collected some shellfish in collaboration with your team, and those results I don't think are complete yet, but we can certainly continue that conversation.
Hi, Elsie. Thank you for your talk. Kind of following up on the novel compounds thing, I was just wondering, it's so puzzling when you look at the mass balance of, how much extractable organic fluorine seems to be in human blood that we can't explain. And I just wanted to know what your ideas are on what those compound subclasses might be. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question, and I think it's probably many different things in many different populations. And I think various groups are now working in collaboration with people like Mark Streiner to look at non-targeted analyses of human serum, and we'll get some answers to that. I think the thing to remember about when we do these studies of sort of subsets of the human population is we're going to get a different answer for each population depending on their exposure profile. So it might be nice to link it, that information, as we start to understand some of these compounds that we haven't previously measured in humans, how they're linked to different vectors of exposure.
Do we have any any questions from the virtual audience? Okay. Any idea of what constitutes the increasing amount of unidentified EOF in humans?
I don't have an idea as to that because that was not my study, but if the authors of that study are online, perhaps they could weigh in on their thoughts.
Maybe as a follow-up to my question, I think some of your work suggests that fluorinated pharmaceuticals might play a role of the EOF in streams. Mm-hmm. How about in humans? Do we know if the increase of the use of pharmaceuticals that are fluorinated increases?
Do we know if a fraction of the EOF would be fluorinated pharmaceuticals? Well, it's certainly a possibility. I think the fluorinated pharmaceuticals are metabolized pretty quickly. But yes, there are a variety of compounds that could make up that fraction, and I think we would have to look at it specifically for different groups.
Last chance for questions. Anybody? There's another virtual question. Okay. From Tony Fletcher, I was impressed by the very high percentage of unidentified precursors. Do most of these get metabolized to identify PFAS in people once ingested?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tony. Thanks for asking it. I think for some of the precursors that I showed in the presentation, so things like FOSA, we know that humans do metabolize them quite efficiently. So you see them mostly as the terminal compound. And I think then there's a question mark because, as I mentioned, there's such diversity in these precursor compounds that it's difficult to lump them. And some of the EOF data would suggest perhaps we are missing others, or perhaps you might see some of those precursor compounds in the human body. Again, I think it's an area where we really need that non-targeted analysis to probe and complement that toolbox when we see large fractions of unidentified PFAS that can't be characterized using targeted methods.
We have one more question.
All right, Elsie, one more. You think a lot about different pathways, including the atmosphere. Is that a concern mostly for dispersion of compounds across big-scale ecosystems, or is that also relevant for the human exposure side?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we've been so focused on water issues and aqueous transport up to this point that the atmospheric pathway got somewhat overlooked. And we know, looking to other classes of contaminants, in many cases, this can be a predominant exposure pathway locally as well as globally. And so certainly there are data coming out saying this is the case for PFAS. This idea has been in the literature for some time. If you look back to some of the early manufacturing facilities and data that were coming out around around those areas. And I think in the literature, around the Chemours facility, there's a really nice paper by EPA where they actually had source release information showing a large signature in that area. And indeed, it does become a problem for elevated human exposures in that area. I think The idea is that the atmospheric releases and deposition are very relevant because they can be linked to surface waters. There may be a connection over longer timescales to groundwater. And you can also think about them impacting different wildlife populations and seafood as well.
Okay. Any more questions for Dr. Sunderland?
All right, well, with that, I think a big thanks to Andrea Amiko, who spoke earlier, and which we didn't give you a full chance to get a round of applause, so thank you again for coming here. And then leading over to Elsie Sunderland's keynote speech. Thank you very much for that. Unfortunately, she was not allowed to travel because Harvard has restricted travel out of state. So those are the current situation in COVID country. So thanks again for joining us live from your living room, I assume, somewhere in the Cambridge area. So thank you very much, Elsie. And unfortunately, oh, sorry, a round of applause. Unfortunately, you cannot join us now for the more social part of this evening, which might involve drinks, food, and some rain outside. So I think we're going to move over to the dry side or the other side of the screens in a minute. So thanks again, Elsie. And my last job for tonight is to show you this. So what's going to happen because of the time differences, for those of you who can't sleep, at 1 o'clock you can join live from Beijing. Excellent lineup of seasoned and going to be stars in the novel detection of PFAS detection effects work, led by Guobian Zhang. And then for those of us who are back here at 8 o'clock, we can meet back here, breakfast, coffee, check-in, and start our day then at 8 o'clock here, and the session starts at 8:45. We then have, after breakfast, we'll have Emily Donovan from the Cape Fear region, slightly different community perspective. And then we have live from Zurich the policy science or science policy interface discussion with Martin Schering, Zhanyun Wang, and a range of European presenters on how the EU is trying to tackle PFAS, maybe using essential uses, maybe as a class, or maybe none of the above. And then after lunch, we get back to the Chinese session for those that did not want to be up at 1 o'clock. We have a long poster session tomorrow, and with a bit of luck, we have a buffet dinner that might be outside on the roof if the rain has stopped by then. So with that, thank you very much for coming, and I hope to have you enjoy the next few days in Providence or virtually. Thank you very much. There's a cocktail or bar set up over there, and then food will